If everybody ate as much frozen yogurt at dinner as I did, you're going to be very sleepy, so, I'll start clapping if I see people asleep. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, but I hope you all seem like lovely people. I met some of you at dinner. Feel free to, if something seems unclear or I have some questions along the way, just shout out, so a little bit participatory, I hope, even though this is like this grand room with this amazing sound system. I like to connect with people a little bit. So my name is Malin Clyde, and I work for UNH and an organization called Cooperative Extension, which is, okay, somebody's heard of it, that's great. We're part of the land-grant college system here at UNH, and we also have Sea Grant, which I have a lot of, actually some of the examples that I've been talking about today will be part of Sea Grant, and we actually already also have Space Grant. So UNH is one of few colleges that have all of three of those grant systems here. I'm a specialist in cooperative extension in the natural resources program area, but my specialty, I have a forestry degree, but my specialty is actually community volunteers. So we'll be talking today, I'll actually be talking today about community and citizen science. I guess I'm also talking about Nature Groupie, but that seemed a little self-serving. So you'll hear about Nature Groupie for sure. You're definitely going to leave here with Nature Groupie stickers. But I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about this really cool trend in science and community action that's being called community and citizen science. So that's going to be really the focus of my talk. So I've always been very interested in, as I tell people when I was in graduate school, I really love plants, I really love the outdoors, but I really love the people that love the plants and the outdoors as well. So that's really helped me gravitate towards involving other people, specifically volunteers in natural resources and natural resource stewardship. I started a project here it was almost 7 years ago actually, called Nature Groupie. It's based here at the University of New Hampshire. We like to say it's like Airbnb for outdoor volunteering. And it's a website. So we have a pool of about 200 different organizations in New England that use Nature Groupie to promote their volunteer opportunities on a calendar. And then we promote those opportunities out to a very wide group of thousands of people who are interested in volunteering for nature. And a big part of it is environmental stewardship, so things like trail work and invasive plant work, restoration projects, cleanup. But also, because we're here at the University of New Hampshire, from the very beginning, we've also been interested in engaging volunteers in environmental research. Because it's my belief that the same people who volunteer to fix the environment are also going to be willing to volunteer to help study the environment. It's the same kind of people, but often the world of citizen science and environmental stewardship are actually separate. So as part of Nature Group, we have volunteer opportunities that relate to, digging, planting, pulling, but also counting, monitoring, viewing, mapping. So that's kind of a cool thing. I don't think the public out there actually makes that big distinction, but some of our organizations do. So my colleagues here at UNH, I have a bunch of colleagues who are interested and involved in the idea of community and citizen science. We haven't always called it that for many years, but things have really strengthened in recent years for the world of citizen science, but also here at UNH. We have a new, what we call an area of expertise in cooperative extension, which is kind of a cooperative extension thing. But we have a new area of expertise that I am the chair of that's in citizen science. We think we're the only one in the US. We think that's really cool. But involves about 6 of us at Cooperative Extension who are interested in citizen science and advancing citizen science in New England. So this is a really exciting topic. I'm genuinely enthusiastic about it. I've never actually given this talk specifically, but all my colleagues on that team are excited to actually start doing these kind of talks more broadly, so I appreciate the opportunity to pull this together. I've done smaller sort of talks, but it's kind of an exciting time. A lot of things are changing. So today I'm going to be talking about community and citizen science. What is it? How do we define it? A little about the history and trends of involving regular people in science. Something about why we should really care about community and citizen science. What are the benefits? Why do we think it's so cool to involve volunteers in research? And I'll go into some detail about a few programs. I, of course, chose examples from New Hampshire. I guarantee you, I guess most of you are from New England, but maybe some elsewhere. I guarantee there are similar projects in your neck of the woods. And I'll help you at the end identify a couple places where you can find and search for those opportunities that are going to be near you. I'm most familiar, and of course I think they're the coolest, the ones that are near me. So what is community and citizen science? And really what we think of this is when both professional and volunteer scientists collaborate to investigate the world around them. So a lot of the examples you'll hear from me today are about natural science. In fact, I think all of the examples are natural science, but it's not necessarily natural science. That is really where it started. But there's citizen science related to astronomy, biotech, molecular biology, all kinds of topics. It's just that the ones I'm most familiar with are in the natural world, and Nature Groupie, by its name, you can imagine most of our folks are interested in the natural world. A little bit about the distinction between community science and citizen science. Has anybody heard the term community science? All right, it's a little bit, it's like almost brand new. It's just a couple of years old. It's been in use. But a researcher named Heidi Ballard from the University of California, Davis, recently published an article sort of making of her distinction of community and citizen science. And she says, really, it's a distinction around who's in charge of the science, who's asking the questions. And we think about citizen science projects as those are being led by a scientist who has a research question, and it could be at a university, or it could be at a museum, or it could be at a nature center even. But the scientist has a research question, and people participate because they're interested and want to help. In general, they're usually collecting and contributing data. Community science, on the other hand, starts with a community group is asking their own question, or they have their own concern. I think of actually a great example as what happened in Flint, Michigan, with a group of concerned citizens around lead in the water, and they actually reached out to a scientist at Virginia Tech, I think it was Virginia Tech, to get that scientific expertise for them to collect their own data and understand a community problem. Community science usually involves more of an environmental justice or social justice component. But it's important to remember that, at least in the world of citizen science right now, those of us who were really into it, it's really important to for any project, community science or citizen science, to qualify as what we call in this group, the data has to be used. And so it could be used by a scientist for basic research, or it could be used by a professional public agency policymaker to inform, using good science to inform policy and inform management. It doesn't have to be, it could even be a school investigating its schoolyard using citizen science data collection techniques. But the idea would be then the principal or the school committee would then be using that data to make informed decisions about how to manage the schoolyard or where to put up our bird feeders. But many of us in this world who have been working here, we see examples of groups saying, let's get volunteers to go collect this because that'll be a cool engagement thing, and then the data doesn't go anywhere. It sits in a filing cabinet. So that's really an important thing to look for, but also to think about, don't just do this just because it seems fun. It's science because it's helping advance science or helping advance learning. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is my favorite, somewhat rebellious slide. And this is actually from a colleague, Abe Miller-Rushing. He's now up in at the National Park at Acadia. But he wrote a paper in 2012 looking at citizen science saying, okay, we're thinking this is all really trendy and cool and new, but volunteers have been noticing and making careful observations of nature for a very long time. It isn't new. In China, they were keeping records of the outbreaks of locusts 3,500 years ago. They have records in Japan of recording the annual blossoming of cherry trees 1,200 years ago. 600 years ago, the French were recording the dates and information about the grape harvest. And of course, our friend Linnaeus, who, he was in medical school, but it was really on these fun adventures that he was taking on the side where he developed his classification system for like all of life. And he was a recreational botanist. Thoreau, okay, we'll have a New England example. He, of course, was an amateur naturalist, right? And he was observing nature around Walden Pond and making really detailed notes about what was blooming when and what he was finding where and the arrival of birds and different sort of phenology 150 years ago. And so humans have been curious about and very carefully attuned to nature for millennia. Professional science, on the other hand, has only been around for about like 150 years, maybe. So I see our friend Sam there on the right, our citizen science volunteer who's there counting and recording the number of oyster spat, baby oysters, on oysters from Great Bay, is really having a strong connection to Linnaeus. And really, we see that the rise of citizen science in recent years can really be looked at as a return to our roots. I like my woman professional science in the middle there. So has everybody here heard the term citizen science? Have you seen it in the news? It's kind of a thing, right? It's in the New York Times. I'm always on the lookout for it. I'm always actually surprised to see it. There's books coming out right now in the popular book lists about citizen science and about getting outside and being an amateur naturalist. I love this, why I count glass eels in the New York Times last year. It's all over the National Science Foundation website. There's New York Times Magazine. And there is a Citizen Science Association that's been holding conferences now. We've had 3 of them over the past, they're every 2 years. But it's a pretty new association. It was only started about 5-6 years ago. There's also an European Citizen Science Association, an Australian Citizen Science Association, and I think Asia and African Citizen Science Associations are sort of in the works. So it's happening everywhere. Question for you all, why do you all think it's exploded in recent, maybe the last 10 years? Any thoughts on that? Oh, yeah, because we have gotten way more fun, right? We humans are totally into fun. We have an interest in science, STEM education, maybe? Could be. I think there's definitely a link there in terms of how do we have people believe in science, that maybe if we involve them in science, they might actually believe it. Maybe efforts to make science more accessible. That could be, that's kind of a dreamy idea. Well, maybe. I'll show you right here. Thank you. So we have citizen science programs that we've been running in cooperative extension for 30 years, and I cannot tell you the difference these days about what it means to have a computer in our pockets. And what are scientists concerned about with their data? Accuracy, speed of getting it to you, how much time it takes to import it and input it into the system. So many things are made more efficient by volunteers able to collect data on their phone. Quality control, you know that someone was actually there taking a photo because it's geolocated with a timestamp. It's just incredible what cell phones have meant to the ability to crowdsource science. So most people agree that it's just incredible, this ability to share data, the ability even to advertise your programs and recruit volunteers through the internet and through social media is just incredible. So, when everybody's complaining about social media and, the demise of civilization, it's actually got a flip side here. It's on the.
Wasn't there a recent book about how our youth are isolated too much from nature?
Yes.
Deliberate effort to get them back in contact with nature.
That's a great thought. Yeah, that's a book. It's called Last Child in the Woods. Yeah, and there's a lot of people in the conservation community where I come from very interested in trying to connect children back to the outdoors for health reasons, but also just maybe to get them off their devices. So this sort of does that, kind of. I think there's also interesting, for the folks in this room who are interested in, or you guys are probably very involved in public data and trends in data, this move towards open science. I think is happening at the same time as the rise in citizen science, the idea that data should be public and open and shared, that we should actually collaborate, and that science will happen faster and more efficiently if we're sharing data. So the idea of crowdsourcing, open science, these trends feed into, I think, this rapid explosion in the recent decade in citizen science. So it's all happening, but the other question is, why is this a good thing? Why is it good for science? Why might it be good for researchers? Why we think it's good for participants? There's all kinds of ideas. I'll present some of them, but you may have other ideas as you start to think about these in your positions at a really interesting place in your institutions, linking research and possibilities towards your local communities, or even just the community of your institution. People who are not involved in science, how might you be a connector? So I'll start off with why citizen science can be valuable to the scientific community. And I think of one of the leading reasons is it can be a tool for answering big questions that would be otherwise impossible to answer. And this is an example, a photo from something we called the New Hampshire Beach Blitz that was, we pulled together about 5 years ago in response to a researcher here who was interested in ocean pollution, actually beach pollution. It's a very hard phenomena to understand because of tides and ocean currents. It's really hard to understand. It's not like water sampling in a lake or a river. It's somewhat predictable, but the tides and the action in the ocean make it difficult. And they were interested in getting simultaneous water samples along a whole 1.5 miles of beach here in New Hampshire. Yes, we do have a 1.5 miles beach. Actually, we have 17 miles, but that's it. So, that would be really hard to get 40 students coordinated. Maybe not, maybe if you had a class, but this person wasn't somebody who had a class. And it was over a whole series of 3.5 hours. They had certain protocols for how this needed to be done. And of course, it's the beach. I was like, no problem recruiting people to volunteer on the beach. That's going to be easy. So we collaborated and got people to take 40 instantaneous water samples along a whole stretch of beach, with, as well as collecting data about seabirds that were there. Were there any kids in diapers? I mean, the protocols were really funny. But again, it's like that would have been impossible to do almost any other way. And with volunteers, you could sort of coordinate it. There's also an example of, I like this one, the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, is the predicting knowledge about where the Aurora Borealis is going to be able to be seen was really bad. Like, scientists could not say where it was going to be seen. They couldn't really understand the phenomena that well. So they started this citizen science project called Aurorasaurus. That was like funny. But it's basically a place where you can go in and just say, yes, I saw it tonight, or no, I didn't. obviously along northern places across the whole globe, and it's improved the understanding and predictions of where the aurora borealis is going to be seen by something like 100-fold, just because they have people looking out their windows everywhere. So again, that's something that was essentially unanswerable without a lot of very connected people across the whole northern hemisphere. So another kind of something that we think about that's not super feasible in our standard research approaches is when you have long temporal scales. So a research project, most research projects, it's like you write a grant to NSF and it's like maybe 3 years at the longest, and maybe you write another one and it's a couple of years longer. But for one research question, if you're trying to get really long-term data sets, they're kind of rare. And involving volunteers can sometimes be a way of extending the longevity of a research question that isn't really going away. And I use this example of a program called the Lakes Lay Monitoring Program. It was started actually out of UNH Cooperative Extension 40 years ago. This year is their 40th anniversary. And it was actually an example of that sort of community science where a group of homeowners around a lake in northern New Hampshire were concerned about degradation of water quality on Lake Chocorua. If anybody knows that, it's on the way to the White Mountains. And they asked researchers at the University of New Hampshire if they would accept their water samples or how could they track the water quality in their lake. Happened 40 years ago, and it's still going strong. Some of the people have been volunteering to take lake samples, and now it's expanded to, 100 and some other lakes in New Hampshire. They've been collecting water samples at their lakes every week during the summer for like 30 years. So if you think about people in communities, they're there. People may come and go, but it's become an institution that people who are involved in this program are going to pass it down to other family members or find a person to replace them when they sell their house on the lake and go somewhere else. So it's pretty amazing to think of the longevity of that kind of program when you're involving people in the community who are invested in that place, more so than a graduate student who's going to come and go after 2, 3, maybe 6 years, depending. Another example of how citizen science can contribute to and benefit sort of the advancing of science is actually discovering new things. And this is an example from Vermont. The state of Vermont, or in collaboration with something called the Vermont Institute of Natural Science, VINS. Somebody here was from the Upper Valley. I can't remember who that was. But anyway, they're a cool organization. They launched this effort to join eButterfly, which is an online platform for butterfly observations. People started using it, and they discovered several instances of butterflies that had no record in the whole Northeast. And again, because they had photos, they had, that were done on a cell phone with a date and a place. There was no chance it wasn't a mistake. They were finding butterflies, not necessarily new to science, but certainly new to the Northeast. And scientists were, ecstatic about those records. And most of these, as I'll explain later, most of these platforms have 100% downloadable data sets that are being contributed to by the public, but that scientists can use to augment their own research questions. So for both professional scientists and the volunteers who contribute the key data, this is really exciting. They're part of scientific discovery, which is, of course, motivating for many people. So the other thing that we think about with citizen science, or things that I think about with citizen science, and many of us, is that citizen science can be valuable to the participants. Like what you were saying, science is fun. I love this audience. Not every audience says that. But it's really important in citizen science in particular to have it be fun, because I can tell you, most people are not going to come back if it's not fun, right? We're doing this on our own time. I remind people of that a lot. I was like, what do you do in your free time? Do you sit here and help a scientist? You better give something back. I watch Netflix in my free time, so it's very impressive that people are giving their free time to help scientists. But I think, thinking about Linnaeus or Sam, the oyster spat data collector, people like to learn. Humans are curious about the natural world. And we just have that sort of biophilia, and I think that this is, particularly in the natural resources world, this is a great opportunity to welcome people into to science and our studies and observations of the natural world. And schools and teachers are getting interested in citizen science as a tool. I'll show an example of that next, which I think many of us think is really cool. Science teaching is something that we're concerned about with the whole world of STEM, trying to improve our metrics in STEM nationally. But also, I think that citizen science may can help a community raise awareness or an organization raise awareness about an issue. If more people are participating, more people are learning about an issue, whether it's the decline of a species or a problem with invasive plants, you're getting more people out there who are somewhat deeply involved in an issue. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute. There is this hypothesis, I'll just say it's out there, that by involving the public in science, that they might be more likely to believe that science is a useful tool and that it might believe in scientific results. And I think when you said, somebody back there said something about climate change, I think there has been, the Union of Concerned Scientists starting to think about our public perceptions of science. Why aren't people taking us seriously? Us meaning scientists. And I think there is a hypothesis that involving people in science may help shift that. I say it is a hypothesis because the research is just now being done. I think the jury is kind of still out. Sometimes there have been a couple papers published that show that actually involving people in science can make them think science is really uncertain, which of course you're like, yeah, I could see that. So we'll see, but I do think that that's sort of one of the underpinnings of why the National Science Foundation, et cetera, is interested in the principles of citizen science and involving people in scientific research efforts. So this is a project, I just thought I'd briefly describe this project. It's called Schoolyard Sites. It's a National Science Foundation funded project here at UNH that I'm involved in. And I'm involved as sort of the extension volunteers side of things. But it's a collaboration among volunteers who are with Extension and Natural Resources, New Hampshire elementary school teachers. Elementary school teachers traditionally, are underrepresented in science in terms of their own science background. It means that elementary school students tend to not get very much science. And so there's a real interest in trying to improve science education at the elementary school level. Most elementary school teachers have not taken much science, and most of them are not majors in science. So it's an area ripe for innovation. And we're working with some folks who are education specialists at something called the Leitzel Center, which is also here at UNH, about science teaching, and collaborating to actually have the volunteers work together, their community volunteers, work with the teachers as partners, form this partnership so the volunteers know about natural science. They don't necessarily know about citizen science, but they know how to identify trees, and they're curious about the natural world. The elementary teachers are good with the classroom management. They're together choosing and identifying a citizen science project and bringing that to their students. Thanks. We just got through our first year of that, and what I thought was very cool was that every single teacher mentioned that it was the fact that they were doing authentic science research and that their data was going somewhere and that scientists were going to use it that kept the kids so engaged. And, I just think that it's different. It's different when you feel like you're part of something real. So just a reminder that all citizen science that we're thinking of, there's some researcher, community member, organization that is using that data. I think that one of the questions out there is about whether citizen science and involving volunteers in science can actually lead to better or more informed decision making. That maybe if you don't have to go through the science publication process, you're involving citizens in research, and it's going straight towards decision making because you have community members involved in the research, and then they're actually also involved in the community decision making, that there might be a quicker sort of science to action avenue. I'll tell a little story about this. We have a project here in New Hampshire. We have that small bit of coastline. People are very concerned about coastal flooding with rising sea levels. This is actually the town of Hampton Beach. That's at high tide this winter. That's a parking lot. Yeah, that's the ocean and the parking lot. Community members in Hampton Beach are very concerned about, they've formed a committee. They came to the university and to Extension and asked, what can we do to help get the word out about the threats facing our community, both infrastructure and education to landowners. It is the coast, but this is not a particularly affluent town. These houses were built in the 40s. They're low-lying anyway. All the rich people live on the highland. They can't move to higher ground. They can't lift their houses up. They're there. And so we're collaborating on a high tide mapping project. It's called a king tide that happens a couple times a year where it's really high tides. And we're actually training volunteers to do this is my colleague Wells Costello, who runs a project called the Coastal Research Volunteers, and he's walking along the edge of the high tide exactly where that edge is, which is really hard. We have a lot of models for that, but this real live data that shows exactly where the high tide is helps improve those models. And then the community, that community group, as well as the Public Works Department in Hampton Beach, is really interested in seeing where those actual lines are on a map, because it changes all the time. They have these models, but are they right? So that's an example of data collection that's happening in the community, going right to public decision-making and community education. We're doing that next fall. Not every project, I think I was talking about somebody with this earlier, not every project is perfect for citizen science. Some protocols aren't particularly safe, like we're not going to have volunteers out there. Well, maybe we are going to have volunteers out there scuba diving in the Atlantic Ocean, but for the most part, we need simple, repeatable protocols. Sometimes it's not free, like working with volunteers is not free. It takes a lot of time and training and upfront thinking about how to involve volunteers. As opposed to working with one graduate student who you need to have one piece of equipment, you often had to have a lot of equipment. So thinking about low-cost data collection tools like smartphones. And then that long-term follow-through. If you don't have it and you're not thinking about it, it can be really unfortunate. And I put up this photo of the horseshoe crab because we had a great project here a couple of years ago with a graduate student who wanted to, and a faculty researcher was interested in horseshoe crabs out in Great Bay. We got a whole bunch of volunteers into it. They did the project for 3 years. The paper was written. The faculty moved on to another topic. The graduate student finished. And all these volunteers were like, we love that project. We still want to collect data about horseshoe crabs. But we're like, well, somebody's got to be using that data, right, for it to be best practices in citizen science. So right now we're trying to think about where there's a pool of people interested in horseshoe crab data collection. But at this point, it's on hold. And the volunteers are devastated. I'm just going to show a couple of slides of projects here. I just have a few more minutes, but I want to point out about, somebody mentioned to me earlier about iNaturalist. It's an incredible app and online program that just gets better and better and better. Have people heard of iNaturalist? Oh, so some people are already using it. Well, you can see there are a few people using it, like 21 million observations. It's used globally. It's based on photography, but also, biological identification of species. It's actually gotten so smart that it'll help you identify the plant or animal that is looking through the screen. It can do that based on knowing where you are. So it's not going to give you a tree in Mexico. It's going to give you trees that are native to New England, the choices. But the other cool thing is it's using the community of knowledgeable naturalists around there to help approve and corroborate your observations. So you might guess that something is a certain kind of fern, but you're going to have other people saying, yeah, that's right, or I don't think so. And if you get a certain amount of corroboration, that data becomes research-grade data. Super cool, very easy to use, kind of neat to actually plan your own place-based citizen science investigation, even of your campus. You can create a project based on your geography. This is another great local project, the New Hampshire Loon Census. This is a one-hour census that happens every year in July. Volunteers go out to every water body in the state and listen or look for loons for 1 hour. So that's pretty cool. Everybody loves loons here, by the way. I don't know if people knew that. There's a couple loons there in the background. But the cool thing about this project, I think, is that it's been very effectively, the data from that project that's been going on for 30 years now has been used to affect policy. So we've got lead sinkers banned in New Hampshire just based on this kind of information collected by volunteers who actually helped rally for that bill about 10 years ago. It's also used annually for management decisions about where to put those nesting platforms you can see on the right. That's a constructed nesting platform for loons. So they make those decisions about where those are needed, where they're not needed based on that census data that happens once a year. You saw that story about glass eels. People know what glass eels are? They're the baby, little tiny juvenile American eels, which end up getting to be this big. Why do we care about them? I chose this because there's a citizen science project going on right now in Durham in the Oyster River. You probably passed Mill Pond Dam, maybe, if you were coming in from the coast. And we're concerned about eels. They're a threatened species in New Hampshire and actually most of New England because in Asia and in Europe they eat eels. They've extirpated many of the native eels in those parts of the world, and they now import juvenile eels from the United States because they don't have eels anymore, and they have never figured out how to get eels to mate in captivity. So they need to get native eels, baby eels. They can pet them in a package and mail them to Asia, and they are worth a lot of money. So they're being poached all over New England, coastal rivers. They breed in the Sargasso Sea, way out in the Atlantic. They're kind of an incredible species. But anyway, we have these things that nobody even knows about. But I can tell you there's about 150 volunteers in New Hampshire who know all about glass eels because they go every single day to the fish ladder here in Durham and monitor the glass eels as they come up to migrate up into the streams right now. Super cool project. That's also coordinated by New Hampshire Sea Grant. I'm going to skip that one. It's totally cool, but I want to make sure I get to the last one. This is about salamander crossings. I think there's a program like this in Massachusetts, too. That's based in Keene. But I did want to talk about this just because of who you all are. This is a project that's coordinated by North Carolina State and their whole university library system. And they coordinate annually a different citizen science project that they involve the entire university community in. This was the one I heard about at the Citizen Science Conference a couple of years ago. This was their first one that they did. And they actually had a university researcher who was interested in urban wildlife. And they checked out game cameras to teams of students and faculty and community members who had these teams. They set up these game cameras all around the campus and the community. And then the teams would download the data, identify all the species, which is the hard work, right? And then they uploaded it to this platform called eMammal, and then they had all these fun prizes, which they got to could win a game camera as a team, and they could all get these t-shirts, and I think it was a big success because they've had a different citizen science project going every year since then. So I encourage you, if you're curious about that, there's a bunch of stuff on their website it's called Wolfpack Citizen Science. Wolfpack is, I guess, their mascot. I thought they were actually studying wolves. I was like, that didn't make sense, but it's not that. So I just want to point out, because most of you are in New England, where you can find out about citizen science projects, there's so many. This is just like a little taste. You can go to Nature Groupie. naturegroupie.org. And we have a compendium of about 50 different place-based, New England-based citizen science projects that you can search by place, you can search by season, you can, I think that's it. Topic. You can wildlife, plants, all that kind of stuff. Again, these are very specific to New England, and they're not those national, thanks, Aurorasaurus, they're not those international platforms. But there's a lot of cool ones. Even bigger, SciStarter, have people heard about that? It's got a lot of sort of national funding to have this international database of citizen science projects. You can do a lot of searching on there as well. There's 2,700 projects on there. This is not just the natural world, but also astrophysics and microbiology and you name it. I will say that I think you have to look very carefully at these projects. There's no screening in terms of what can be on there or who's behind it. There's definitely not there isn't always a researcher on the other end using the data. And so that's something really important to, in terms of thinking about best practices, but they don't do a lot of screening. So I think it's important to really look hard at those projects because they're not all, not all super, some of them seem kind of like off the cuff. But with 2,700, there's a lot to choose from. I found this research, this reference when I was preparing for this talk. The Arizona State University has done actually a bunch of work. They have an NSF grant to think about community libraries in citizen science, and this is actually a really nice reference that's available online for free. The Librarians Guide to Citizen Science. It looked like they'd been doing some neat work, working particularly with community libraries on involving people in setting up citizen science projects, how to choose them, that kind of thing. And a little bit about what we like to think about when we're thinking about what might be a new project for a group of volunteers. How do you choose what to look for in a citizen science project if you're going through? And I think of, the same things that we probably think of when we're thinking about research of our own. What do we hope to discover? What are the researchers hoping to discover? That should be in there up front. It's not just give me your data. It's what am I hoping to discover? What are the benefits to me as a participant, but also for the researchers and for the wider world, at what differences it's going to make? And how will I contribute? Is it just data, or am I going to be involved in analyzing the data or helping to design a project even? How soon or when is my data going to be disseminated back to me? So scientists would love to sit on that data and make it really perfect for 2 years, but that's really disappointing if you've been sending your data in, you're not going to actually see it along with the other data. So that's actually an important thing, and the best projects have that almost instantaneously. So when can I see the results? And what can I learn as a result of participating? So those are some of the things that we think about when you're trying to think about what is going to make a good project. There's such diversity in projects. You will just be, if you start getting into this, you're going to be blown away. Really cool stuff happening all over the world, and even not in our local communities here in New Hampshire. But I guarantee there's going to be stuff near you as well, and that you'll find it either through Nature Groupie, SciStarter, or even other nature centers or museums have a lot of these programs going on too. So I think I have time for a few questions before everybody goes, I don't know, partying. I don't know what you do in Durham on a Thursday night. What is it, Wednesday night? Wednesday night.
I'm going to take a nap after this. So I think you touched on this a little bit, but just curious if you could speak a bit more to the challenges of having objective data collected by citizen scientists versus subjective data. I think you did speak a little bit about, if you get multiple observations, they all start to agree with each other. But I don't know if you could just talk a little bit more about any projects in that or challenges faced that have to do with that distinction.
I think I understand your question. I think that's something that there's a lot of time and effort that goes into setting up good protocols for citizen science projects, because there isn't the kind of like careful supervision that there might be of a couple of graduate students, right, where you're checking in with them every couple of days. And but there is so quality control is really important, but also having that a lot of the time they're using a smartphone to have it's not relying on the person's identification skills. You're able to check it. There's actually been a lot of research in the citizen science community, and pretty well established that if they have good, quality control, we've learned a lot about techniques for that and training volunteers, that citizen science data is as reliable as data collected in many other ways. So there's been a lot of literature about that. Although I think folks who are new to the process are often, researchers who haven't seen it are skeptical, for good reason. But again, I think it's using some of these tools, but as well as, we're doing a lot of checks where you're coming back and visiting the volunteers. We have a group of volunteers who does beach profile assessments every month here on our coast. And they'll go through this pretty rigorous training. They work in groups. That's another thing that can be helpful in terms of checking the protocols. Most volunteers, in my experience, and many of us our experience, note that when people know that they're contributing to real science, I find they're actually more careful and ask more questions than if than I was when I was a graduate student. They have this sort of attitude that they need to be, that they know that they're doing science, they need to be really careful. And so I do think working in groups can be helpful in terms of making sure, they all have that attitude and they're trying to make sure they're doing it right. And then a couple months later, our team will go out and do it with them again to sort of check, like, how are things going? There's also a cool thing that's called community peer review. And so we'll come back and bring all the volunteers back together once a year and have them look at the data. Like, how's their data look compared to the other beaches? And having them see discrepancies in the data is incredibly powerful. I mean, frankly, we actually haven't seen it. They're incredibly careful. But, even having them draw some conclusions and ask some new questions about their data, it's very cool to see that, science learning, but also them working with the researchers and posing new questions. So, I think it's a concern, but I think it's a concern that is tackleable.
Well, it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about are examples of well-managed citizen science projects. So that actually dovetails nicely into my follow-up question. So Nature Groupie sounds like a curated list, and then that other one, SciStarter, is just if you feel like it, you can throw your citizen science project on it. Is that an oversimplified
I'm sure they wouldn't characterize it that way. But for example,
this is a safe space.
Okay, this is a safe space. They're super cool. They're in Washington, D.C. They're much more influential than I am. But there isn't, with that many projects, they're welcoming all comers. And I'll just say that, a couple of years ago, I saw, they were advertising, it's a nonprofit. It's not like nobody's making any money at Nature Groupie either, for the record. But, they were advertising a citizen science project where you could submit your face photo for some facial analysis, and I was like, ugh, it sounded like creepy racial, I just got all these sense of, I don't know, racial profiling or something. Very unclear what it was for, but send us a picture of your face. And I could find nowhere on the website that said, who's behind this? Who's the researcher? What's the institution? It was not leading with that sort of, integrity of, and so I actually wrote to SciStarter and I was like, you guys got to put who's behind the projects. That's important to me. I want to know what the data is being used for and who's going to keep it. And they did actually change the site. I don't know if it was because of me. I'm sure other people were saying that too. But it started off very much, crowdsourced. And I think it's gotten a little bit more disciplined in what they'll put on there, but I don't think they have. We know all of these projects. We know that there's data is being used on every single project in Nature Groupie. I would also encourage you in your communities, if you know this is not comprehensive, if you know other cool citizen science projects happening that they want to post on Nature Groupie, there's actually a button to submit your citizen science opportunity. So we just started this about four years ago, that directory. So we're looking to add more. So please, those of you in New England, encourage people to post their stuff on Nature Groupie.
Hi. I was wondering if you could comment a bit more about online citizen science projects, and I'm thinking specifically about like Zooniverse, where you can do everything online. You can be geographically anywhere.
Yeah.
You can just. You're not contributing photos
I'm totally
or anything.
biased to the outdoor nature ones, but it's so funny. My husband was like, snores when I talk about this. But then I told him about Zooniverse, which I almost use that as one of my examples. And he was like, oh, I would totally do that on my lunch hour. So there's something for everyone. The Zooniverse is this platform that they developed at the University of Minnesota for analyzing, like big data sets and using humans to do what computers actually don't do very well, which is actually classify. The first project was animals on game cameras in Africa, and they wanted you to say, is it an elephant, a lion, a giraffe? How fun is that? Anybody can do that. And you're looking at these game cameras that are going all night, and you actually are saying what the animals are doing. They're drinking, they're not there, or that's an animal's foot. You're just classifying photos. You can do it like 100 an hour. And it's really just, it's crowdsourcing some of those tasks. But they've expanded beyond that. They made the platform open to anybody who has big data. So they have like astronomy photos where you're having to compare photos of galaxies. Again, for some reason, computers are actually not as good as human brains at doing some of that work. So it's a really cool site. You can just go on there and just do it on your lunch hour. Again, I'm totally biased to the ones that take you outside, but Zooniverse is the place for that. You can do any kind of project on it, and it's really good technology. It's really user friendly. So I'm glad you mentioned that. There is something for everyone, and including those of us who don't actually want to go outside.
We have time for a couple more questions. Oh, Robert there.
Hi. So with my librarian hat on, and as somebody who spends some time at the reference desk, I can totally picture scenarios where people would be interested in finding research projects or papers specifically where citizen science was used. So I don't know if in your experience when researchers write up these papers and publish them, do they talk about the fact that they've used citizen science? Do they use the term citizen science in their write-ups? Or do you know of any of the websites that you mentioned or any others that you know of where they're kind of creating archives of papers that have used citizen science?
Yes, it's a great question. When we started Nature Groupie, it wasn't actually called Nature Groupie, about 5 years ago, we were actually trying to determine what the term is for this that we should use. And even as recently as maybe it was 6 years ago, it was not clear what the universal term should be, because there was public participation in science, PPS, there was like volunteer science. But really between those, what the volunteers all said when I said, what do you call this? They said, well, we want to use the term that the scientists use. And so the scientific community is using that term citizen science, and that's why it's really taken off. But now there's, again, this effort to say, well, or community science, or community and citizen science. So the term citizen science is absolutely what the folks who are using citizen science in their research, that's the term to use, and they are using it. There's some actually great compendium studies that are looking at the prevalence of the use of that term in scientific research and showing, the bar graph of it going woo like this in recent years. So it is the word to look for, and that's certainly best practices in citizen science is to give credit to the other people involved in your research. So to my knowledge, that is something that folks who are working with volunteers are giving them credit, and that's the term to use.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. One more question in front.
So you did talk a little bit about safety concerns early on, and that's something I was wondering about because of some experience I've had with citizen science. I'm wondering if there are accepted best practices for safety, liability issues, et cetera, so you don't have teenagers crossing major highways in the middle of the, yeah.
Yeah, were they doing like salamander crossing brigades or something like that?
Water sampling.
Water sampling, yeah. I mean, the truth is that that is really under the purview of the folks who are organizing those volunteers. And I think there is probably a lot of variety in people's experience of working with volunteers, and considerations of safety is something Extension has been working with volunteers through, like 4-H and master gardeners for 100 years. We think a lot about that for our citizen science projects, but a local nature center, maybe just like this is their first attempt at it. So I think there probably is quite a bit of variability. It's a good question to ask. We actually started in order to try to support more volunteer involvement in both research and stewardship, we actually started a tool sharing and equipment sharing library that's based in Epping. It's really cool. It's free for those of you in this area. But it has safety cones. It has reflective vests, really cool clipboards, but safety glasses. Because we find that our partners don't actually have a full set of those to involve with 25 people going out and doing a project. And that's such a perfect opportunity for shared resources. I think it's a great thing that libraries could be doing, checking out equipment like that. Because again, we have that stuff in cooperative extension, but we were finding our nature centers and our nonprofits, land trusts who might have this as a little part of their work, they don't have that stuff enough for 25 volunteers. They might have enough for their staff. So I think that there's a great role for that in libraries of things. That there might be a role for public libraries in the safety equipment. It doesn't address the training, but safety vests. It's like that's a good thing. We should all wear those outside on the street.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
I feel like
thanks.
I've learned so much. A big round of applause for our evening speaker.